September 21st, 1327. Deep within the cold stone walls of Berkeley Castle in England, a grim scene unfolds. Here lies a 43-year-old man. His beard is graying, and his once bright eyes now lack their spark. He's on a makeshift bed in a cell, his wrists and ankles marked with deep chains. His face tells a story of humiliation and pain. This man, born a prince and trained to rule an empire, is now just a forgotten prisoner. His name, Edward II Plantagenet. Just months ago, he was King of England. In the dead of night, two men slip into his cell, bringing with them a tool of medieval torture, a red-hot iron. What happens next is so gruesome, so cruel, it sends shockwaves throughout history. The fallen king is restrained, and a horn tube is forced into his anus. Through this tube, the blazing iron is pushed in, burning his insides without leaving any visible marks outside. His screams are silenced by pillows. By morning, they find his lifeless body, his face twisted in a final expression of agony. The official report: natural causes. This account of Edward II's death is the most famous, dramatic, and shocking. It's a story that feels almost legendary, portraying a tyrant facing punishment for his so-called sins, including his rumored homosexual relationships. But was this really how it happened that night in Berkeley? To grasp this historical mystery, we need to rewind and look at the complex, tragic life of this controversial king. Edward was born on April 25th, 1284, in Caernarfon, Wales. He was the fourth surviving son of the formidable King Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, and Eleanor of Castile. Edward became the heir to the throne after his older brothers passed away. From a young age, it was clear he didn't share his warrior father's traits. While Edward I was a fierce military leader and shrewd politician, his son was more interested in activities deemed unfit for royalty. Swimming, rowing, crafts. He enjoyed hanging out with common folk. Some accounts even say he liked to dig ditches, fix roofs, and work with metal. This rejection of chivalric ideals drove his father into rages. It's said that in one fit of anger, King Edward I tore out handfuls of his son's hair because he had asked for a title for his favorite friend, Piers Gaveston. This young nobleman from Gascandy joined the royal household as the prince's companion, but quickly became more than just a friend. The bond between Edward and Gaveston would spark a series of troubles that ultimately led to the king's downfall and death. When Edward I passed away in 1307, his son, just 23 years old, took the throne as Edward II. One of his first moves was to bring back Gaveston, whom his father had sent into exile, and give him the impressive title of Earl of Cornwall, a title usually meant for royalty. Even worse, to the nobility's outrage, Edward showered Gaveston with royal treasures and allowed him to carry St. Edward's crown during the coronation, a privilege unheard of for someone not of royal blood. Historians have debated the exact nature of Edward II and Gaveston's relationship for centuries. Chroniclers of the time used vague phrases suggesting the king's profound love for him, describing a bond of unwavering loyalty. Some historians argue this language reflected the medieval ideals of strong male friendships. But others note that later writers were less subtle, with a bishop in 1334 accusing Edward of sodomy, a medieval term for homosexual relations. Regardless of what their relationship truly was, Edward's actions with Gaveston turned out to be a political nightmare. In 1308, he married Isabella of France, the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV, as part of a typical diplomatic arrangement. However, during the wedding festivities, Edward focused all his attention on Gaveston, completely ignoring his young bride. Things got worse. Reports from that time say the jewels Edward gave Isabella as wedding gifts ended up with Gaveston. The humiliation for the Queen, only 12 years old, would stick with her forever. The English nobility, led by the king's cousin Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, soon demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward caved in, only to bring him back soon after. This back and forth happened several times until, in 1312, the barons captured Gaveston and executed him on the side of the road, stabbing and beheading him. Edward was heartbroken and swore vengeance. Out for revenge, Edward had to make a temporary peace with the noble assassins. But his reign faced serious trouble. In 1314, he suffered a terrible defeat to the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn, losing lands his father had conquered. He was a poor administrator, letting the royal treasury run dry. Politically, after Gaveston's death, he made the same mistake again by giving too much power to another favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Together, Hugh and his father turned into the real rulers of England. They used their sway over the king to amass wealth and lands, silencing opposition with executions and confiscations. Queen Isabella, now grown up and feeling sidelined, developed a fierce hatred for the Despensers, and for her husband too. It all came to a head in 1325, when Isabella was sent to France for a diplomatic mission. She refused to go back as long as the Despensers were in power. Things got even messier when she fell in love with a powerful, exiled baron named Roger Mortimer, who had escaped from the Tower of London and was intent on toppling Edward and his favorites. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer stormed into England with a small army. To Edward's shock, the nobility and the people welcomed them like heroes. The king and the Despensers tried to escape west, but were captured. Hugh Despenser the Younger faced a brutal public execution, dragged by horses, hanged from a high gallows but cut down before dying, castrated and forced to watch as his genitals were burned, disemboweled with his intestines set aflame while he was still conscious, and finally beheaded. His head was paraded on London Bridge. As for Edward, he had to step down for his 14-year-old son Edward III in January 1327. At first, he was held under fairly comfortable conditions, but by April he was moved to Berkeley Castle under the watch of Thomas Berkeley and 2 other men. The conditions worsened. Reports say he was purposely kept in filthy surroundings, made to ride without pants to irritate him, and possibly even subjected to psychological torture. The goal seemed to be to drive him to die of natural causes, sparing Isabella from the dirty work. Mortimer felt the weight of guilt, but Edward proved to be surprisingly tough. He didn't just keel over as quickly as everyone hoped. Rumors of rescue plans started to swirl, and a fateful choice was made. On September 21st, 1327, they say Edward II was murdered. Now, this is where the story gets critical. What really went down that night at Berkeley Castle? The most popular tale is the one about the red-hot iron used through a tube. But that story popped up decades later in histories. One major source was Geoffrey Leaker's chronicle from around 1350, detailing Edward's death in a brutal way that left no visible wounds but caused unimaginable suffering. Modern historians, though, have their doubts. They think the hot iron story might have been clever propaganda, pushed during Edward III's reign. He was the one who had Mortimer executed and locked up his own mother. Feeding this story only painted his father's killers in a worse light and linked the gruesome death to Edward's supposed sexual life. Some scholars suggest that if Edward was really killed, it would have likely been through simpler methods like suffocation with pillows, which wouldn't leave marks. Others go even further, questioning if Edward actually died that night at all. An incredible theory showed up in 1333. It came in the form of a letter, known as the Feast Letter, delivered to King Edward III. An Italian cleric named Manuel Fieschi claimed he'd heard the confession of the real Edward II years after his supposed death. According to this story, Edward escaped from Berkeley Castle while a porter's corpse was passed off as his own. He supposedly traveled across Europe, ending up as a hermit in Italy. This idea gained traction when a man named William the Welshman surfaced at the court of the Holy Roman Empire in Koblenz, claiming to be Edward II. While most historians remain skeptical, a few respected scholars think it's possible Edward might have survived. What we do know for sure is that there was a royal funeral for Edward II in December 1327 at Gloucester Cathedral. His elaborate tomb still stands there today. But what happened to the body? Edward II's body was embalmed, making it hard to spot any injury he might have suffered. After Edward III took over in 1330, he executed Gurney and sent Travers into exile, blaming them for his father's demise. The tale of Edward II's violent death, whether true or not, left a mark on English culture. Christopher Marlowe wrote a play about it in the late 16th century, depicting the king as a tragic figure, a victim of his desires and the harsh world of politics. While Marlowe didn't spell out the murder method, theater productions often dramatized it with a scene featuring a red-hot iron searing it into the public's mind. Edward II's case is crucial because it marked one of the first formal removals of an English king. This set a risky precedent for future monarchs like Richard II and Henry VI. The idea that a king could be taken down by his own people shook the foundations of medieval beliefs about royal power, often seen as divinely ordained. Plus, the connection between Edward's sexuality and his downfall created a narrative that replayed throughout history. The notion that unorthodox sexual behavior by rulers can lead to catastrophe. This idea lingered in European culture for years, affecting how characters like James I of England and Henry III of France were portrayed. Regardless of how Edward II died, whether by that brutal iron in some other way, or even if he escaped to live quietly, his story is a striking example of the clash between personal desires and royal responsibilities. It highlights the struggle between individuality and the harsh expectations of medieval rule. Today, nearly 700 years later, people still visit Edward's tomb in Gloucester Cathedral, captivated by his tragic tale. The image of him carved in alabaster shows a calm and noble king, with no hint of the horrific end that legends suggest. This striking contrast between the dignified monument and the dreadful story might be the perfect conclusion for a king whose life was full of contradictions, someone who held complete power yet faced a powerless end.